Morgan Freeman finished reading the letter, set it on his knee with both hands, and did not speak. Not for 1 second. Not for 2. He sat in the guest chair with the letter face up in his lap and his hands resting on top of it, and his eyes directed somewhere past the cameras, past the audience, past the walls of the studio, somewhere that only he could see. And the silence that came from him was not the silence of a man who had lost his words, but the silence of a man who had found something so large that words were, for the moment, genuinely inadequate to it. Jimmy Fallon was already crying. He had been crying since the 3rd paragraph of the letter, quietly and without apology, his hand pressed lightly over his mouth, his eyes never leaving Morgan Freeman's face. Tears were streaming freely down Jimmy's face now, and he was not trying to stop them, not even slightly, because some moments are larger than the effort of appearing composed, and this was one of them. 300 people in that studio had listened to Morgan Freeman read the letter aloud, and now 300 people sat in the dark and did not breathe, and did not move, and waited, as one body, for a man who had never in his career been at a loss for what to say to find his way back to language. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Someone counted later. 11 seconds of complete, unmanaged silence on live television, during which the most recognizable voice in American cinema sat with a letter in his lap and let the room hold what the letter had put in it. Then Morgan Freeman looked up. He looked directly at Jimmy Fallon. And the expression on his face, the expression of a man who has been alive for 86 years and has long since learned to receive whatever arrives with dignity, broke, just slightly, at the corners. Just enough. He said very quietly, "I have been in this business for 60 years. I have played every kind of man there is." He stopped. He looked down at the letter again, then back up. His voice, which is one of the most controlled instruments in the history of acting, was not entirely controlled when he spoke again. He said, "I have never been handed anything like this." It was a Tuesday evening taping, April 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Morgan Freeman was the guest, a living legend at 86 years old, an actor whose voice had become so deeply woven into the fabric of American culture that people used it to describe the sound of authority, of wisdom, of God, of time itself. He had 2 Academy Awards. He had been nominated 5 times. He had spent 6 decades building a body of work that did not belong to any single genre or register, but simply belonged to the best of what human storytelling was capable of when it was handled by someone who understood, completely and at the cellular level, what it was for. The audience had risen before he reached the desk. They always did, for Morgan Freeman, but this ovation had a different quality than most. It was the ovation of people who were not simply applauding a career, but expressing something closer to gratitude for the fact of a person, for the specific and unrepeatable fact that this man had existed and had done this work, and had given it, all of it, without reservation, for 60 years. He received it with the grace that only comes from having been in enough rooms to understand that the applause belongs to the people giving it as much as to the person receiving it, and that the most honest response is simply to stand still and let it be what it is. The interview had been exactly what it should have been, thoughtful, unhurried, full of the particular intelligence and dry humor that Morgan Freeman brings to every conversation he decides to take seriously. They talked about his new film, about his ranch in Mississippi, about what it felt like to have been working at this level for this long, and to still genuinely want to do the next thing. He was sharp and warm and entirely present, the way great actors are present, with a quality of attention that makes you feel, even through a screen, that you are the only person in the room, and that what you are saying has been heard. Then, At the end of the second segment, Jimmy Fallon reached under his desk and produced an envelope. He held it for a moment without speaking. He looked at Morgan Freeman with an expression that was careful and slightly tentative. The expression of a man who is about to do something irreversible and wants to be certain it is the right thing. He said, "Someone sent this to the show 8 weeks ago. I have read it probably 20 times. I asked you here tonight partly to promote your film and partly because I needed a reason to give you this in person, in a room full of people, because I think it deserves witnesses." Morgan Freeman looked at the envelope. He looked at Jimmy. He said, "All right." He opened it carefully, unfolded the 2 pages inside, adjusted his reading glasses, and began to read aloud in the voice that 300 people in that studio had grown up hearing as the voice of everything serious and true and lasting in the world. He read for 6 minutes. He read until the last line. And then he set the letter on his knee with both hands. And the silence came. The entire studio froze. Not because something dramatic had occurred, because something real had, which is always more arresting than drama. Because Morgan Freeman, a man who had voiced the creation of the universe in a film, who had played God twice and Nelson Mandela once, and had made all 3 equally believable, was sitting in a television studio with a letter in his lap that had done something to him that 60 years of extraordinary work had apparently not prepared him for. The band had stopped somewhere in the 4th paragraph, without being asked. The cameras kept rolling. The director in the control room had not spoken into a single headset since Morgan Freeman's voice had taken the room over. 300 people held their breath and waited. And Jimmy Fallon cried without stopping, and 11 seconds passed in total silence. Then Morgan Freeman spoke, and the room came back, and a single whispered sentence floated out over 300 people like something that had been looking for a place to land for a very long time. He said, "I knew a woman named Cecilia Price, and in the 5th row, a woman in her mid-40s, with the particular composed stillness of someone who had been waiting for this sentence for the entirety of her adult life, pressed both hands flat against her cheeks and closed her eyes. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1964. Because Morgan Freeman wasn't always Morgan Freeman. Academy Award winner, the voice of American cinema. The man whose presence in a film tells an audience, before a single line of dialogue, that what they are about to watch is worth their full attention. He was once just a 27-year-old man from Memphis, Tennessee, who had been trying to make it as an actor for 7 years, and who had recently begun, quietly, and without telling anyone, to wonder whether the trying was enough on its own, or whether trying required a quality of faith he was no longer certain he possessed. In the spring of 1964, Morgan Freeman was living in New York City and studying acting and doing what actors do when they are not yet working, auditioning, rehearsing, taking whatever small parts were available, surviving. He had come to New York in 1959 after 4 years in the Air Force, drawn by a certainty he had carried since childhood that the stage was where he belonged, and that New York was where the stage was. The certainty had not diminished in the intervening years. What had changed was his understanding of the distance between certainty and arrival, which turned out to be a much longer distance than he had known how to account for at 22. He was working that spring at a theater on the Lower East Side, a small off-Broadway company that produced original works by young playwrights in a converted storefront with 40 seats and no air conditioning, and a reputation among the people who cared about such things as a place where something real sometimes happened. Morgan Freeman had a supporting role in a 2-act play that was being produced for a 6-week run. It was not a major role. It was not even a particularly interesting role, but it was a role. And it was on a stage. And he took it seriously the way he took every role. As if the size of the audience, and the length of the run, and the prestige of the venue were variables entirely separate from the quality of the work itself. The play ran for 4 weeks before the company ran out of money. It closed on a Saturday night in April. The cast gathered in the small lobby afterward and said the things that casts say when something ends that they had hoped would last longer. And then they went out into the city, and Morgan Freeman walked home alone because the subway fare felt like a choice. And walking was free. He was passing a laundromat on Delancey Street at 11:30 at night when a woman inside knocked on the glass and held up a wallet. He had dropped it. He had not known he dropped it. He went inside. Cecilia Price was 32 years old, a registered nurse who worked the evening shift at Bellevue Hospital and did her laundry late because the laundromat was quieter after 10, and she was, by temperament and profession, a person who preferred quiet to noise when she was given the choice. She was from Greenwood, Mississippi, from a town 40 miles from the town where Morgan Freeman had grown up. A fact that did not emerge until 20 minutes into the conversation that began with the wallet and did not end for 2 hours. They talked because they were both from Mississippi and New York in 1964, and that alone was enough to make a conversation feel like a reunion. They talked about the South, about what it meant to have left it and to carry it anyway, about the particular homesickness that is not for a place exactly, but for a set of sounds and smells and textures that you did not know had organized your sense of the world until you were somewhere they did not exist. About what they were doing in New York and why, and whether the why was holding up under the weight of the how. She asked what he did. He told her he was an actor. She asked what he had been in. He told her honestly, small roles, nothing she would have seen, a play that had just closed after 4 weeks. She did not perform encouragement, which was the thing he needed most and received least. She simply asked, "Is it going to work?" He said he did not know. She said, "What does it feel like when you are doing it?" Not the career, the acting itself. What does it feel like when you are doing the work? He thought about that for a moment, standing in a laundromat on Delancey Street at midnight with his wallet in his hand. Then he said, "Like the truest thing I know how to do." She said, "Then it is going to work." The truest thing a person knows how to do always works, eventually. It just requires more time than people expect, and less certainty than they think they need. She wrote her telephone number on the back of a laundry receipt and gave it to him when he left. He called her twice over the following month. They met for coffee once, a Sunday afternoon in May, and talked for 3 hours about everything except whether they were going to see each other again. They were not. She was practical, and he was broke, and the city was large, and they had found each other in a laundromat at midnight, and that was, perhaps, already more than the city usually provided. She moved back to Mississippi in June of 1964 to care for her mother, who was ill. He stayed in New York. The career did what she had said it would do. It worked, eventually, requiring more time than he had expected and less certainty than he had thought he needed, exactly as she had described. The slow build through the 60s and 70s. The breakthrough in the 80s. The first Oscar nomination. The awards. The films that became part of the permanent record of what American cinema had been capable of in the second half of the 20th century. He thought about Cecilia Price on the nights when the doubt came back. Not often, but sometimes. The way doubt returns even to people who have been given every reason to be free of it. He thought about what she had said in the laundromat. The truest thing a person knows how to do always works eventually. He thought about how she had not softened it with false certainty, had not told him it was definitely going to work, had only told him the condition under which it would, and that the condition was already met, and that the rest was a matter of time and patience, and the willingness to stay with something past the point where most people stopped. He had no way to find her. Her name was common enough that the searches he could have run in the early internet years returned nothing useful. Mississippi was a large state. He held the conversation the way you hold things you cannot locate, carefully, without clutching, in a place where it would not be lost. Cecilia Price had married in 1967. She had become Cecilia Tanner and had raised 3 children in Greenwood, Mississippi, and had worked as a nurse for 38 years and had retired in 2002 to her garden and her grandchildren and the specific quietude of a woman who had done a great deal of good in the world and had not needed to be recognized for any of it. She had followed Morgan Freeman's career from the first moment it was visible to follow, with the particular private pride of someone who had been in a room with something before the room knew what it was. She had watched every film. She had been quietly, consistently, entirely unsurprised by all of it. In the laundromat on Delancey Street in 1964, she had heard him say the truest thing a person knows how to do, and she had believed him. And the 60 years since had confirmed what she had understood in that single sentence. Her daughter Vanessa, a woman of 44 who was a teacher in Jackson, Mississippi, found the story by accident, by listening to her mother describe it over dinner one evening in the autumn of 2023. A dinner at which Cecilia had been more reflective than usual because she had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure the previous week and was sitting with the particular clarity that certain diagnoses produce. Vanessa had listened to the whole story without speaking. Then she had gone home and written a letter to The Tonight Show that night at her kitchen table because it was the only address she could find and because the letter needed to go somewhere before time ran out. She wrote everything her mother had told her. The laundromat, the wallet, the late-night conversation, the question about what it felt like, the answer, the sentence about the truest thing. She wrote, "My mother has never asked for anything from anyone in her life. She is not asking for anything now. She is dying, and she asked me, when I told her I was writing this, whether she thought it was too much. I told her it was not too much. I told her that some things deserve to be said before the person who said them runs out of time to be thanked." She thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "All right. Tell him the laundry came out well." Behind the scenes, Morgan Freeman had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. When Jimmy Fallon's team had contacted Morgan Freeman's representation 8 weeks earlier with the letter and the story and the question of whether he would be willing to appear on the show, Morgan Freeman had called Jimmy Fallon personally. He had asked 2 questions. The first, "Is she still living?" The answer was yes, though not for long. The second, "Is she in the building tonight?" The answer, after 3 weeks of arrangement and 1 transatlantic phone call to Vanessa in Jackson, was also yes. He had asked that Cecilia be in the audience without being told why. He had asked that no one on the show's staff tell her the segment involved her until the moment it became clear on its own. He said, "She spent 60 years watching without being seen. She deserves to be surprised. She deserves to be the one who doesn't know what's coming for once." Cecilia Tanner had been brought to New York by Vanessa 3 days before the taping, ostensibly for a long-promised visit that Vanessa had been postponing for years and had finally decided to stop postponing. She had been given a seat in the 5th row of the Tonight Show studio and a program that listed Morgan Freeman as the evening's guest, which she had read in the pre-show waiting area with the same quiet, unsurprised expression she wore for most things, a small smile, a slight nod, The face of a woman who considers the world's coincidences less surprising than most people do. She had watched the interview from the fifth row with her hands folded in her lap. She had not leaned forward. She had not made any move to identify herself or draw attention to herself. She had simply watched, with the composed attention of a woman who had been watching this man work for 60 years from a respectful distance and saw no reason to change that now. Then Jimmy Fallon had reached under his desk and produced the envelope. And Vanessa, sitting beside her mother in the fifth row, had reached over and taken her mother's hand. And Cecilia had looked at her daughter and then at the stage, and something had shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, but the thing that comes just before surprise. The moment of the mind understanding what the body already knows. She had listened to Morgan Freeman, read her daughter's letter in his voice. That voice. The one she had heard for 60 years from every screen and speaker the world had offered, and she had not made a sound. Not one sound. She had sat with her hands folded in her lap and her composure entirely intact until the very last paragraph. When Vanessa's account of the dinner conversation reached its final line, and Morgan Freeman read the sentence, "Tell him the laundry came out well," and something happened to Cecilia Tanner's face that her daughter had never seen before in 44 years of watching it. She laughed. A single, full, entirely unguarded laugh. The laugh of a woman of 72 who has just heard her own joke delivered back to her in the most recognizable voice on earth. In a television studio in New York City, 60 years after she made it in a laundromat on Delancey Street at midnight. The laugh lasted 2 seconds, and then it became something else, and she pressed both hands flat against her cheeks and closed her eyes. Now Morgan Freeman was looking up from the letter. He had said her name. He had said, "I knew a woman named Cecilia Price." And the woman in the fifth row had her hands on her cheeks and her eyes closed, and she was not hiding. She was receiving. She was taking in 60 years of something finally arriving at its destination and allowing herself, for once, to be the person it arrived for. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Morgan Freeman stood up from the guest chair. Not slowly, not with the careful deliberateness of an 86-year-old man being cautious. He stood the way a man stands when he has decided to do something, and the decision is already complete before the body has fully caught up. He stepped off the stage and walked down the center aisle of the studio toward the fifth row, and 300 people parted around him the way water parts for something moving with certainty through it. He stopped at the fifth row. Cecilia Tanner opened her eyes. She looked up at him. He was standing 2 feet away, and the distance between them was 60 years, and also no time at all. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small piece of paper. Yellowed, folded once along a horizontal crease. A laundry receipt, the kind issued by Coin laundromats. The carbonless kind with the faded purple ink that was already half gone when it was new. On the back of it, in handwriting that belonged to 1964, was a telephone number with a New York area code that had not been in service for 50 years. He had kept it. For 60 years, in wallet after wallet, transferred from one to the next as wallets wore out and were replaced. The laundry receipt moving forward through the decades, the way certain small things move forward, not because anyone decided to keep them, but because no one could bring themselves to let them go. He held it out to her. Cecilia looked at the receipt, at the handwriting on the back. Her chin dropped. Her breath left her in a single quiet exhalation, audible in the silence of the studio, caught perfectly by the microphone on Morgan Freeman's lapel. "You kept it," she said. He said, "I kept it the way you keep the thing that told you the truth about yourself at the exact moment you needed to hear it." She reached out and took the receipt from his hands. She held it in both of hers, lightly, the way you hold something that has survived a very long journey and deserves to be held with the care that its survival earned. She said, "I meant what I said about the truest thing." He said, "I know you did. I knew it in the laundromat, and I have known it every day since." She looked up at him. Her composure, which had lasted 72 years and had been present for everything life had asked of it, was not entirely present now, and she did not appear to mind. She said, "Was I right?" Morgan Freeman looked at her for a long moment, with the full, unhurried, completely undivided attention that had always been the most recognizable thing about him. More recognizable than the voice. More recognizable than the face. The quality of presence that had made 60 years of audiences feel that they were being genuinely seen by the screen. He said, very quietly, every word. Jimmy Fallon had long since stopped trying to manage anything. He was standing behind his desk with tears streaming down his face and both hands pressed flat on the surface. And he was not speaking because there was nothing to say. Because language had reached its limit in this room several minutes ago, and what remained was something language could point toward, but not contain. Questlove had set his sticks on the snare with a care that was its own form of tribute. The band stood. The camera operators were crying. The director in the control room had not spoken since Morgan Freeman began to read. 300 people rose. Not all at once. 1, then 3, then 10, then all of them, the way standing ovations rise when they are real, rather than reflexive. When the body decides before the mind. When the room simply lifts. The applause was enormous and sustained and warm, and it filled the studio and found no ceiling, and Morgan Freeman stood in the 5th row, with Cecilia Tanner's hand in his, and the laundry receipt between their palms, and neither of them said anything more, because everything had been said, and it had been said in the right room, and it had been heard. Cecilia Tanner flew home to Greenwood, Mississippi, 2 days after the taping. Vanessa sat beside her on the plane. Cecilia held the laundry receipt in her coat pocket the entire flight, her hand wrapped lightly around it, not gripping, just present. She passed away in July of 2024, 11 weeks later, at home, in her garden, in the early afternoon, in the particular way that people pass away when they have finished what they came to do, peacefully, and in the right place, and without apparent reluctance. Vanessa was with her. Morgan Freeman was told the same evening. He said nothing to the press. He planted a magnolia tree on his ranch in Mississippi that autumn, in the flat black soil of the Delta, in the general direction of Greenwood. He did not announce it. The people who work on the ranch noticed it in November. Already rooted, already beginning to belong to the land the way magnolias do, when they are planted by someone who understands they are planting something for a longer time than they will be alive to see. The laundry receipt is framed now, in Vanessa's house in Jackson. It hangs beside a photograph of her mother at 32 years old, a hospital ID photograph from Bellevue, 1964, the same year. The year of the laundromat and the wallet, and the 2-hour conversation, and the sentence that held a career together across 6 decades of doubt and distance, and the long ordinary passage of time. In the photograph, Cecilia is looking directly at the camera. She is not smiling, exactly. She is wearing the expression of a woman who knows something, and has always known it, and has decided to be patient about the rest. She was right about all of it. She was always right about all of it. Some people are. The truest thing of her